Here is a world of communication, bringing together all people in a new era of understanding.
Elektrischer Reporter.
Ist der Ruf, liebe Zuschauer daheim an den Empfangsgeräten oder von wo auch immer Sie uns gerade zusehen, ist der Ruf erst ruiniert, lebt sich's gänzlich ungeniert, reimte dereinst der große Dichter Wilhelm Busch. Gar nicht ungeniert lebt es sich mit einem ruinierten Ruf hingegen in der Bitchin Society, einer auf Reputationsökonomie basierenden Gesellschaft, ausgedacht vom Science-Fiction-Autor Cory Doctorow. Auch netzaffinen Zeitgenossen, die mit Zukunftsromanen eher wenig anfangen können, dürfte Doctorow ein Begriff sein, als einer der 4 Autoren hinter dem populären Blog Boing Boing. Warum er selbst nicht in der von ihm ersonnenen Reputationsgesellschaft leben möchte, wie das Internet unser aller Denken verändert und wie mit Boing Boing alles anfing, das erzählt uns nun Cory Doctorow.
Yeah, my co-editor Mark Frauenfelder and his wife Carla Sinclair and some of their friends started a print magazine in the 1980s called Boing Boing. And I think they were originally doing it in Colorado and then moved to San Francisco to do it. And that was a time in America where a distributor picked up zines and started distributing them nationally all over the US. And that meant that all of a sudden zines that could previously only be gotten either through the post if you knew that they existed or in your hometown were suddenly available at stores all over the country. And this created a huge explosion in zines, including for Boing Boing. Boing Boing did very well for a while. And then this distributor went bankrupt and they took all the zines with them because they were sitting on lots of inventory for the zines and they were sitting on lots of money that they owed the zines, and none of that money ever was given back to the publishers. It all went to the bankers. And so Boing Boing folded up as a print concern, and this was the time at which Wired magazine was launching, the dot-com bubble was growing in San Francisco, and Mark ended up as the managing editor or editor-in-chief of Wired Online, Wired Digital. And so that kept him really busy, and he moved from there to doing lots of other tech reporting, including for the industry Standard. And one day he was doing a piece for the Standard on Blogger, Blogger the service, and he thought, I should start a blog so that I can write about it for Blogger, or for the industry Standard. I can try out Blogger. So he started a blog and he needed to call it something, so he called it Boing Boing and he started blogging on it. And then he asked me if I would guest edit for him while he was on holidays, and when he came back he said, you did a great job, why don't you stay on board? And it seemed like a great idea to me. I'd read Boing Boing growing up when I was a teenager. I worked in a bookstore where we sold Boing Boing back in those national distribution days. So it seemed like a good thing for me to do, and we invited a couple more people in over the years, and now we have a blog. With the caveat that all numbers about statistics of readers on websites are bullshit. Our bullshit numbers seem to be quite large compared to other people's bullshit numbers. And certainly we have a larger bullshit audience than most other people's bullshit audiences. So I think that there's some truth there. As to why, I think that there are a few things that contribute to it. Naturally, I hope we have good taste and that we write well. But I think the 2 other things that contribute to it are, one, that we're very descriptive in our headlines and our opening sentences. We anticipate that the majority of readers, and particularly the majority of new readers that find Boing Boing, will find us in a search engine results page, an RSS feed, a forwarded link, something that's been aggregated somewhere else, and that by writing as though that headline were the only thing the reader would get access to, we eschew those headlines that are like funniest thing ever, just click it, in favor of things like very descriptive, very plain headlines that are nevertheless intriguing to people who are looking for a specific piece of information. That's been very good to us. And then the other thing is we've just been around for a long time, and the longer you're around, the more people there are who've linked to you. The more people there are who've linked to you, the easier it is for someone to find you. The easier it is for someone to find you, the easier it is for someone to link to you. It's kind of a rich get richer phenomenon, and it may not be fair, but we were lucky. We were really early on. Oh yeah, sure. The 4 of us make a pretty decent living off of Boing Boing. We all do other things because Boing Boing has always been something that we did in support of our other activities. It's been our kind of open notebook in which we record all the useful and interesting things that we're involved with. And so we continue to do all those other things as our, in some ways, our primary activities, even if it's not our primary source of income. Writing novels is really what I do, and I do some public speaking and some consulting, and I write columns and so on. But yeah, Boing Boing makes a pretty good living. I could do just Boing Boing and live pretty comfortably. I think there's some of that in the US. I mean, I'm a Canadian, but I've lived in the US, and I think there's some of that. I think that it focuses on the wrong aspect of what makes blogging distinctive. The thing that makes blogging distinctive isn't its non-commerciality, but the way that that influences the subject matters of a blog. So the traditional publishing method is to identify subject matter that you think advertisers want to advertise against. So like, there are advertisers who'd like to buy advertisements in magazines about race cars. And then what you do is you try to write a magazine that will attract people to read the race car magazine, so the race car advertisers will buy advertising in it. And there's nothing wrong with that model. It's brought some great magazines to the field and other great publications, but it's not the only way to do things, and it's not, I think, how the best blogs do things. I think the way that the best blogs work is you start with someone who's passionate about some subject or a variety of subjects, and they write about the things that are interesting to them, and they hope that there will be readers who share their interests, and that there will be advertisers who want to reach those readers. And so it kind of turns it on its head. Instead of writing stuff that you hope will attract readers, you write stuff that you hope will express yourself, and then you attract readers by expressing yourself. And you know, I think provided that you stick to that, it doesn't really matter whether or not you have ads. The real metric is whether you're writing stuff that you're passionate about, not whether or not you're getting paid for it. Down and at the Magic Kingdom is a science fiction novel that I wrote that was published in 2003. It was my first novel, and it's about a world in which all the material problems of human society have been resolved. So there's enough money for everyone, there's enough food for everyone, there's enough everything for everyone, we all live forever. So what's left? And what's left is how you apportion those resources that are inherently scarce, like only one person can sit at a restaurant at a table at a time, only so many people can go to Disney World at any given time. So how do you apportion all the rest of that stuff? And I posit that one way you could do it is through a reputation economy. And so I invented some magical technology, and that magic technology is something that allows a computer system to know how you feel about everything at any given time. So how do I feel about this flower pot? How do I feel about you? How do I feel about this restaurant? How do I feel about each discrete thing in the universe? Now, obviously we don't have this technology, but based on the idea that you can calculate that, you will then have a score that's the aggregate score of how all the people in the world who know you feel about you. And if I run into you and I've never met you before, I can look at how your score is. I can look at how highly regarded you are by the whole world, and how highly regarded you are by people who are friends of mine. And based on that, all scarce resources are apportioned. So if I show up at a university and stand behind the lectern and start teaching, provided I have enough woofie, which is what this metric is called, I'm the teacher. If enough people think that I should be, I am. If I stand up at this restaurant and I start seating people at the tables, if I have enough woofie with the servers and the chef, then I'm the maitre d'. And so it's a Gedunken experiment. It's not intended as a proposal for a social order. It's meant as an allegory about how a lot of resources get apportioned on the internet, and particularly how we manage resources in a post-scarcity world of certain kinds of entertainment and other ideas, where culture has stopped being hard to transmit, where in fact it's now hard to stop culture from being transmitted. And so that's a really different world to inhabit, the Napster world. And so what do you do when that kind of stuff that was previously precious because it's scarce is now precious because it's infinite? No, I don't think so. I don't think a reputation economy is, at least as envisioned Down in the Magic Kingdom, is entirely utopian. For one thing, as you see in the book, it rewards popular ideas over good ones. So people who say unpopular things don't attract a lot of woofie. So minority points of view and unpopular points of view aren't really protected. And I think one of the first duties of a liberal democracy is to protect minority points of view and a diversity of opinion. The other problem with it is that it has the same economics as blogging and really as of the real world, which is that the rich get richer. So the more woofie you have, the easier it is to attract opportunities to get more woofie, and that makes it easier for you to get more woofie. And that's I think not ideal. That's not a system with that kind of stratification of the social order without social mobility is not the hallmark of a good liberal democracy. Sure, yeah, I think we already see some of that. I think that actually the most interesting one is invisible. It's not an articulated system, but rather a set of assumptions. I think that it's critical that the internet was designed by engineers and scientists and not by lawyers or politicians. So the way you do engineering and the way that you do science, it hasn't, in some important ways, hasn't changed much since the Enlightenment. And it's predicated on the idea of peer review, publication and peer review, and open access to knowledge. You know, the difference between alchemy and science is whether or not you tell people what you're doing. You know, if you write it down in a book and no one else can see it, that's alchemy, it's superstition. As soon as you start publishing what you think you know and other people can poke holes in it, you've got science. And so that's why I think when you hit, for example, when you hit Control-R, and when you've received an email, that the reply imports the entire text of the message you're replying to. Even though if a lawyer were designing it, they go, well, that's a copyright violation, we mustn't do it. The way that engineers and scientists do engineering and science is, I publish a paper, I give it to you, and you mark it up with a red pencil, and that's in fact how our email conventions function. So when I hit reply, I mark up your email as though I was marking up a scientific paper with a red pencil, and it's it's a very different ethic from the ethic that reigns in other disciplines, particularly in law and politics. And so what we've done is we've started to push a certain kind of scientific approach to knowledge sharing through the whole world. And I think you see that reflected in a lot of other cultures, and particularly in mashup culture and so on. That open publishing ideal really originates on the internet, or originated in science, propagated through the internet, and is now finding its home in humanities and in other fields of endeavor as a result of the internet infecting the way that we think and do business in all fields of endeavor. So now even lawyers write like engineers, do business like engineers. You know, William Gibson in his new book, in Spook Country, he talks about cyberspace everting. That is to say, turning inside out and starting to infect the real world. And I think that's true. I think cyberspace was always best understood as a metaphor. I think Gibson or Sterling called it the place where you are when you're talking on the telephone. The place where the telephone conversation takes place. And I had a really interesting conversation with a guy named Tom Jennings, who created a system called FidoNet, which was one of the early multi-system conferencing systems before we had widespread access to the internet. So it was a kind of equivalent of Usenet, but it was you could do it without being a participant in an academic institution or a large corporation. And so there were message boards that span the whole world, and people all over the world participated in them together. And one of the things that was a common source of discord on FidoNet, one of the common arguments, was about whether or not someone had the right to talk to you this way in your own home. So someone would say, that message was very rude, and if you're going to be that rude, you'll have to leave my house. Because the feeling was that because the message was on your computer, that the person who'd sent it to you was in some sense in your house. And they were speaking to you in a way that was unforgivable as a guest in your home. And you know, it was because this was before the term cyberspace was widely understood, and before we had this concept that a conversation between two computers over a network doesn't take place in one place or the other, but rather in some third virtual space in between, that we were able to actually start to reconcile some of those difficulties. And I think that was one of the most important contributions that cyberspace made to the real world. But that said, I think that some of the cyberspatial ideas are everting. I think that, for example, there are, with some of the distributed presence tools, you know, like Jaiku or Twitter, that we're starting to see the kind of distributed presence, the kind of presence information that kind of, I think, who just wrote this in Wired magazine? It was Clive Thompson in Wired magazine called it a propriatic sense for the real world. So, you know, propriatic sense is the sense that you have. It's a kind of almost a sixth sense that you have of kind of where your body is in space. And when you put your teeth together, it's how you know that your teeth are actually coming together. And he says that we have this kind of ambient sense of where everyone in the world is around, all the people who matter are around us and how they're feeling. And that's one of the ways in which cyberspace, I think, is everted into the real world. I think the next, well, not the next, but one big change that's coming are a series of privacy ruptures, big bangs, one after another. So one of them is, we just saw Nikolai Nieholm do his presentation about facial recognition software. Someone's going to get facial recognition software really, really right. And when they do that, every photo on the internet will suddenly have a name associated with it. Every person in every photo will be identified. And that will be an enormous rupture of privacy. Photos that you'd previously thought private because they couldn't be aggregated to your name will suddenly be aggregated to your name, and husbands and wives will break up, children will have fights with their families, people will lose their jobs, politicians will be felled, people will go to jail, sometimes justifiably, sometimes not. Dissidents will be rounded up and executed or disappeared or put in jail. All of that stuff will happen as a result of this, and that's just one of many. There will be lots of ways in which we take disparate pieces of information and combine them. Our RFIDs, I think, will be one of the ways in which this will happen. We have a myth that RFIDs can only be read at a very short distance, and I have one in my pocket from the conference here. So this RFID, it does two things. When you bombard this RFID with radio energy, so when it senses or interacts with that radio energy, and then transmits by radio a unique number, a globally unique identifier. And the myth is that you can only read it from a very close distance, and that's because you can only excite it. You can only bombard it with radio energy from a close distance. If you tried to excite this with radio energy from, the top of that building over there, you'd have to pump so much radio energy into the air that like passing birds would fry and fall out of the sky. So it's not practical. But if you had a reader just here on this post, and I put the RFID on it, the reader would excite the RFID, and the RFID would start transmitting its unique identifier. And if you had a very focused antenna on the top of that building and a reader here, the antenna on the top of that building could see it. And as we have more RFIDs in our lives, readers which contain the exciters, the bombarders, will start to propagate, and you'll see them all over the place. In addition, you'll see people, I think, putting in rogue bombarders, things that just emit radio energy in order to excite an RFID. So if you want to read all the RFIDs passing by this point, you hide a little RFID bombarder in this post, and you go stand on the top of that building there with your sniper antenna, and that two-part system works to read the RFIDs at a very great distance. And that, I think, is going to be an enormous privacy rupture, because now what we're going to have is the ability to track people through time and space, not just by the police, although that's bad enough, and by government, that's bad enough, but by criminals, by snoops, by racists, by all kinds of elements who suddenly are going to be able to keep track of us. And I think it's fundamentally because we've designed these systems without any privacy controls, and we've decided that it's good enough to just make one that has no privacy controls, and we can add the privacy controls later. It's going to be very hard to do that. So I think that you're going to see these giant privacy ruptures, and I think that every one of them is going to be a kind of earthquake for society. It's going to upend all kinds of institutions, it's going to upend all kinds of relationships, and it's going to make it harder, I think, for many of us to conduct our lives. There is a fundamental dignity in being able to be private. It's not because the things we do are shameful, but because they're not public. Every one of us poops. There's a book, everybody poops. We all go to the toilet and we poop. But you need to be a very special kind of person to want to do it in public. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's private, it's personal. And I think we're going to lose some of that, and I think that that's a real shame.
Und nun zu etwas völlig anderem. Was ist eigentlich Web 2.0?
Web 2.0 ist, wenn Frauen auf Männer mit hohem PageRank stehen.
Vielen Dank. Und das, liebe Zuschauer, war es auch schon wieder für heute. Ich verabschiede mich und wünsche Ihnen eine inspirierte Woche. Bleiben Sie uns gewogen und schalten Sie auch das nächste Mal wieder ein. Bis dahin bleibe ich Ihr elektrischer Reporter.
Für einen kosmischen Moment fallen Teilchenschauer und ihre Botschaften auf Netzhäute und erregen Zellen, die mit einer Frage antworten. Bei ungünstigem Karma wird diese Frage nie vergessen und spiegelt sich in jedem Gerüst der Natur. Alles wird zur Suche und Meilenstein. Mit jedem Tag wird die Vergänglichkeit der eigenen Dauer errichtet und der Irrwitz des Jetzt ist verhöhnt Sterne.